Welcome back for part 2 of the 2020 recap. If you already watched part 1, well, thanks for being here. And if you didn't, click the button in the top corner right now and then come back and restart the video. Because if you don't do that, you'll be stuck in an endless loop of 2020 over and over and over, and nobody wants that. Least of all, our special guest from the channel What's Bothering Me Today.
Hi everyone, here's what's bothering me today.
He's going to start things right where we left off, with a smart investment opportunity for some of those sweet, sweet defunded police dollars.
I never talked enough about the Ontario teachers' strike and why it was pretty much historical, and also another reason why we should absolutely vote Doug Ford out in 2022.
Quick recap on this one. In late 2019, all 4 major teachers' unions voted in favor of strike action in response to proposed cuts from the Ford government. And in January, the unions began working to rule, followed by a series of rotating strikes, escalating until the ETFO, OSSTF, OECTA, and AEFO coordinated an Ontario-wide demonstration.
What you're seeing here is a show of unity between all of us. The different things that are on the table hardly matter in the face of a government that wants to slash fundamental supports for all of our students, and that's why we're prepared to stand up together on Friday, February 21st in a full-day action.
Thousands of teachers descended on Queen's Park to protest the government's proposed class size increases, mandatory e-learning, funding cuts for special education, and Bill 124, which caps public job increases to just 1%, or half the cost of living increase.
The Ford government is not listening, and unfortunately they've pushed us to this point.
The last time this many teachers were out of their classrooms in Ontario was 1997. 20 years on, the issues are much the same. Again, it's a progressive conservative government making cuts to education.
Currently, I have 32 students in my classroom.
And what's that experience like right now?
Well, right now, it's a challenge getting to every kid.
All 4 major teachers' unions got together to strike and to protest. And what did the government do? Do you think they actually listened to the experts and decided, okay, you know what? Well, we've seen the error of our ways. Do you think they did that? No. Instead, they began to throw a disgusting amount of money and media spin against the teachers, trying to redirect public support away from them.
The government here is honest, above board, and always tells the truth. Just kidding!
Conservatives went as far as trying to pay off parents to earn back their support, but it didn't work. Oh no. With Ecos polling showing nearly twice as much support for teachers over Ford and Lecce's cuts, and the polls just kept coming.
In the ongoing battle for public support, it seems like the unions are winning, at least according to a new Dart Insights poll. The poll found 63%, or 2/3 of Ontarians, believe unions when they say this fight is over mandatory e-learning, expanded class size, and other quality of education issues, not, as the government has repeatedly said, over teacher compensation. On the question of who is to blame for the current situation, 46% of those polled said the government, while only 24% said teachers' unions.
The public stood by the teachers because the teachers had just consistent messaging. It's not about us and like paychecks and stuff. This is about your kids, their education, and their future.
In the end, each union struck a deal with the government, accepting the cap on pay increases in favor of protecting education itself. The ETFO deal maintained funding for full-day kindergarten and included $88 million in funds to create nearly 500 jobs supporting special education, Indigenous students, ESL students, and mental health, while the OSSTF deal maintained a 23-student class size cap instead of the proposed 28 kids, which would have cost thousands of jobs in the process. And they knocked the 4 mandatory online courses down to 2 with an opt-out option for parents. So while teachers were able to hold back most of Ford's cuts, imagine what direct action could do when negotiating with a good faith government that accepts science and recommendations from advocates like Sick Kids, who essentially vindicated the unions once COVID hit, pointing to class size caps and using non-traditional spaces to spread out and maintain safety, or recommending funding to address a lack of education staff staff or structural issues like ventilation. School boards and parents were just as concerned about the class sizes when school resumed, with nearly 300,000 people signing a petition calling on Ford to finally listen to the experts. And as for online learning, well, it's clear now that the Conservatives had no rollout plan at all, with parents, students, and teachers all struggling to make e-learning work in the fall, particularly for students with disabilities, many of whom depend on one-to-one interaction.
It was the largest, cohesive teacher strike in 20 years in Ontario. It was impressive because it shows once again what solidarity can do, what a well-organized strike can do, and if you have consistent messaging with a very simple message, that can help keep people on your side, and the government and all its power and money can't possibly hope to win against that.
Since Bothered Boy brought it up, there's a government win we do need to talk about.
There's been some very underreported news, which is a shame because it has massive repercussions across Canada's public healthcare system.
There's always someone trying to privatize this or that part of our healthcare, and back in 2009, Dr. Brian Day launched a lawsuit against the BC government because patients can't pay for private healthcare when the public wait times were too long. But medical experts in the BC government argued that this would create a two-tier system, allowing the wealthy the ability to jump the line.
Oh no.
Which incidentally is what an audit revealed Day was doing at 2 of his clinics in 2012, pulling in $500,000 from just over 200 patients. BC residents polled don't like this either, with 73% responding in support of public healthcare, 90% agreeing that healthcare should be delivered based on need, not ability to pay, and 80% agreeing that for-profit healthcare will only give faster service to the rich.
The idea that private healthcare is a right. A right is something that has to be applied universally and equally to all people. And if it can't, then it's not a right, it's a privilege.
After 10 years, it ended in a win for public healthcare, with doctors and nurses praising the decision for stopping wait times from being extended further by keeping doctors in the public system rather than being siphoned into for-profit clinics for the wealthy. The BC Supreme Court ruled that the right to life isn't at stake. Ultimately, the sustainability of our universal healthcare system is aligned with fundamental justice.
The ruling emphasized the strength and the importance of public healthcare, which is a cornerstone of our identity in British Columbia, a cornerstone of our identity in all of Canada. Encouragingly, many physicians testified that surgical wait times have improved in their practice in recent years, and that the province has introduced initiatives that successfully reduced wait times.
And it's true that BC is among the lowest ranked for wait times, lagging behind the other provinces in meeting the service benchmark for every patient. But that gap has been closing in recent years, with wait times improving nearly across the board. And that's thanks to the BC NDP introducing $175 million in funding over 2 years, dedicated to system improvements and OR efficiency. And after thousands of surgeries had to be put on hold to make space for COVID overflow, the government topped up their commitment with another $250 million per year, and I kind of don't think we'd see private healthcare invest that much.
If privatization was so good, you wouldn't need to sabotage public healthcare to do it. You wouldn't need to do what Alberta is doing.
Contrast what we just saw with Kenny's United Conservatives cutting 11,000 medical staff, outsourcing the jobs of lab workers, housekeeping, and food service staff to save a buck. This led to Alberta Health Services staff, already stretched to their limits by the pandemic, to take things into their own hands, going on a wildcat strike on October 26th. At least 51 separate hospitals and clinics walked out in the strike, which was ultimately ordered to end by the Labour Board that night.
Typical for Jason Kenney, he is a terrible person and pretty much an evil monster at this point. But 11,000 healthcare jobs cut, and funding for public healthcare cut, also that you can try and make private healthcare more appealing. That's not the free market. That is not innovation. That is you and your cronies and your ghouls trying to squeeze public healthcare and then replace it with private healthcare.
Unfortunately, the situation hasn't gotten any better, with beds being double stuffed into ICUs by December, and the record-breaking COVID cases of late October looking like a fond memory, as those records were broken many times over by the holidays. And that's to say nothing of the UCP membership voting with a 53% majority in favor of a motion to support a for-profit healthcare system in their 2023 campaign platform.
Oh no!
Speaking of forward-looking policy, our next story involves every Albertan's favorite province. Recently, the Quebec government announced its plan to reduce emissions 37% by 2030, in part by banning the sale of gas-powered cars by 2035, following the lead of BC, who in 2019 set a 2040 deadline.
The problem is that it only targets passenger vehicles available to the common civilian market. Big freighters and trucks and things like that, those will of course be exempt. Now, of course, that's where a lot of the industry is, so it will help, but not as much as what needs to be done.
The ban and $8,000 EV subsidy will help address year-over-year growth in gas-guzzling SUV sales and generate a surplus of oil executives as a bonus, but experts point to the target set by Legault's government as not possible to hit with this plan. Massive transit investments are needed to address the 40% of emissions that stem from transport.
We know that we'll need to invest more and more in collective transportation. That's the future.
That's the goal of lawmakers and transit officials who plan in addition to the light rail electric train project known as the REM.
Even more recently, the government announced 2 lines will be added to the REM network, connecting East and North Montreal to the downtown core, flexing on Toronto while addressing issues like poverty and accessibility alongside CO2 emissions.
It is good that it still happened, that it will help reduce emissions, and it also shows that things like the climate action strikes and sustained protests and pressure on governments and politicians, if you just keep hounding them about, hey, how do you plan to keep this green, or make a Green New Deal, or have a green recovery? So long as you keep the messaging constant and keep pressure on these people, change can happen, even if it is only slow and incremental.
And while I can't prove it via headline screen grabs, it's logical to look at the largest protest in Quebec's history as an influence on a populist like Legault.
And while that is a good thing, it still bothers me that it's only a little bit, you know? You only got a little bit of progress, and from Quebec. And we're not seeing the full changes that need to happen.
Changes like what Green Jobs Oshawa has been suggesting long before the GM plant closed, nationalizing our manufacturing infrastructure to build electric vehicles and batteries at home. The auto workers tried to force a Green New Deal, but without a willing partner in government, in the end Unifor only got conventional trucks back in production. But their negotiating got Fiat to accept the future and retool the Windsor plant to make EVs, and the union made Ford see the light as well, with 5 EVs to be made in Oakville. But even with all those jobs saved and created by the workers, the best the Ontario and federal government could come up with was throwing money at these very profitable corporations. Such a lack of vision. I'm not even mad, I'm just bored. And okay, I know you've been wondering it by now. How are they going to address the one electoral win the left had this year? And our next story does just that. After all, Erin O'Toole is the working class hero we need. Oh sorry, wrong potato head. John Horgan's NDP won the BC election back in October with the party's largest majority ever, and there's a bunch of reasons why. It might have been that the Liberals with their forgettable platform and leader were bogged down by, well, the standard amount of scandals we've come to expect. It might have been that the NDP finally did politics, calling the election within weeks of Sonia Furstenau becoming the leader of the rival Greens. It might have been that people were impressed that 96 of the 122 promises from their 2017 platform were kept, leaving only a handful of big-ticket items unfinished, like the BC Hydro Freeze, $400 rebate for renters, or finally creating an Endangered Species Act. But I think that it was that an overwhelming majority approved of their handling of COVID. That's it.
So everyone talked about the big BC NDP win, about how, wow, it's the biggest majority that they've gotten in real leftist politics. All right, cool, that's just gonna happen. We're done now. We're not.
In fact, the 2020 platform was pretty unambitious, with notable promises being $1,000 checks, rents frozen in 2021, and those $400 renter rebates again, plus rebates for drivers on ICBC. But they did promise to make transit free for kids under 12 and announce some major infrastructure like extending the SkyTrain to Langley and new elementary and medical schools. But I mean, it's no Barrett government. The first BC NDP passed 96 bills in 61 days, 367 bills in total, with things like the Agricultural Land Reserve, Pharmacare, and the public auto insurance of ICBC, each of which have stood the test of time.
The BC NDP, as leftists in BC will tell you, is still actually pretty terrible on the environment and on native rights.
I know, we just dragged the NDP's colonial approach to forcing Coastal GasLink through in part 1, so let's drag their weak environmental policies too, and the desperate need for that protection of endangered species, like sacrificing fishers for the fur trade, or caribou for the forestry industry. And then there's the Site C Dam, which was revealed to literally be on shaky ground, while running way over budget every moment it isn't scrapped. And Horgan's obsession with liquefied natural gas, several projects developing the methane fuel, make the NDP's climate targets impossible to hit. A CCPA report shows that the LNG Canada terminal alone will exceed the targets by 160%.
This is not a time to relax and say, oh, I trust them to do the right thing and it's a leftist government, so things will automatically be good. No. This is the moment where we now hold their feet to the fire, where we hold them accountable and keep them to their word. Because then either we actually see that the NDP is actually different from other mainstream parties once they get a majority, or we see that they falter.
And it's clear the grassroots need to organize this push alongside left-leaning MLAs, as we've seen the NDP misuse the political capital of a virtual majority during COVID, neglecting to implement major crisis bills like a wealth tax, or new infrastructure like transit and housing that would solidify a generational legacy, much like Barrett in the 70s. But don't take it from me, Harold Steeves was there in the 70s, and he's pulling for the new MLAs and young eco-socialists to stand against the party brass and have the courage to act based on principle.
And if they falter, then that makes a lot of people question electoral politics and instead consider turning to things like direct action and general strikes and large labor movements and sit-ins and civil disobedience and disruption and things like that.
Yes, and we definitely don't want people doing things like that. Mobilizing our numbers into networks of decentralized organizations or local citizens assemblies that can wield power? No way, that's not for us.
Oh no.
But that brings us to our final story, and before we get to that, I want to remind everyone to go subscribe to What's Bothering Me Today, and check out the honorable mentions that didn't make this list, and a companion video which jumps off our next topic, which is, you guessed it, Jagmeet and AOC absolutely murdering each other and a bunch of leftist YouTubers and streamers in Among Us.
While it showed that it's always good to have international leftist solidarity and solidarity with progressives around the world, that's all well and good. But the Among Us stream with Jagmeet Singh and AOC also showed that this is a fantastic way to discuss policy, to see politicians outside of a political sphere and having a bit of fun and being relevant to the youth.
It's true, whether bonding through genuinely charming moments like #Jugmute, highlighting the legacy of NDP CCF policies like the ICBC or insulin delivering healthcare, or organically bringing up why fossil fuels are still being used in the future world of the game, which, I mean, they may have some disagreements about why, but people are already requesting more members of the NDP, and not Justin Trudeau, get some screen time to hash these things out with players and viewers in real time via extrajudicial killings.
I'm going for the double. 100% northern. 100% northern.
Everybody.
Northern. Sorry, brother. I'm gonna vote for you, man.
He's just. Oh my God, he's
okay.
The worst.
What do you got?
He's literally the worst. Canadian media is probably like American media, where they're a little bit more critical of leftists. If you keep clapping everybody over and over again, they're gonna write about this. Like, Jagmeet is too convincing as a murderer on a spaceship.
But what actually happened was a whole bunch of media outlets that wouldn't usually cover the NDP or talk about socialist policies were praising the stream and these highlights. Not to mention that AOC showed how streams can be used to fundraise over $200,000 for eviction defense legal aid, food banks, and mutual aid groups in her community. Imagine an NDP using this model to both rhetorically and financially support leftist dual power, helping anyone from 1492 Land Back Lane to Jane Finch Action Against Poverty to the climate justice groups in and outside the halls of parliament.
Like, of course it was fun to see Jagmeet Singh and AOC, you know, be imposters and kill famous YouTubers and other politicians. It's all good fun, right? But they also had a chance to talk about policy and why it made sense to them or why they supported it. You know, it can feel very personal and touching as opposed to a political ad campaign. And in the case of policy, Jagmeet Singh decided to drop a bit of a bombshell on the Among Us stream, where he was talking about a new NDP policy proposal that they were going to come up with, which was to create a publicly owned pharmaceutical lab here in Canada. But I'll have more thoughts on that in my own video.
I can leak a little thing. We're going to be talking about this next week, but we also want to publicly be able to manufacture vaccines and other medication.
Oh,
so yeah. Because it's like kind of one of those things that's it's really speaks to the sovereignty of your country if you can produce them yourself. So we want to we're going to start floating this idea next week.
Yeah, I mean, there
you heard it here first.
By which...
Yeah, this is crazy. Breaking news.
This was a great way to both highlight their ongoing push for pharmacare while talking about the extremely relevant value of re-establishing a publicly owned pharmaceutical lab. Linda McQuaig's book, The Sport and Prey of Capitalists, goes into great detail about Connaught Labs, the once great public lab that created groundbreaking medicines like penicillin, insulin, and the polio vaccine, freely offering their research to support the health of the world, unlike the publicly funded but patented medicines of big pharma.
This Among Us stream could potentially be a way forward and a new way of reaching new audiences and successfully reaching those audiences. Will this pay off in terms of an added voter base? Only time will tell, but it's certainly a positive development, and the fact that we don't talk about that enough is definitely what's bothering me today.
So that's it. Even though 2020 was a dumpster fire, I hope this dumpster dive was at least entertaining, or better yet, showed that our struggles and the energy we put in is worthwhile. I want to thank What's Bothering Me Today again for helping me waffle over these 10 topics. Please subscribe to his channel and watch the companion video about how the NDP are the only party fighting alongside working class movements. The links for that and both of our Patreons are in the description box. Special thanks to my patrons for supporting me in 2020, and to everyone who has watched my content. I didn't expect the very warm welcome I received from you all, and I'm genuinely so grateful. I'll be taking the next little while to regroup and refresh my content, so look for something new in like March or April. I don't know, it takes forever. And until then, always waffle to the left.